The morning mist clung to the waters of New York Harbor like a shroud of impending doom, as General George Washington stood atop the ramparts of Fort Greene, his weathered hands gripping the cold stone. It was late August of 1776, and the largest military force ever assembled in North American waters lay anchored just beyond the harbor's mouth. 400 British ships stretched across the horizon, their masts creating a forest of death that would soon unleash hell upon the American colonies. Washington's Continental Army, numbering roughly 20,000 men, had been preparing for this moment since the British evacuation of Boston earlier that year. The American commander-in-chief knew that New York would be the next target. It was too strategically important to ignore. Control of New York meant control of the Hudson River, effectively splitting the rebellious colonies in half. The stakes could not have been higher, yet as Washington surveyed his forces, a gnawing doubt ate at his confidence. The majority of his soldiers were militia farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers who had answered the call to arms with hearts full of patriotic fervor. But lacking the discipline and training of professional soldiers, they had tasted victory at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. But those had been defensive actions against smaller British forces. What awaited them now was different entirely. General William Howe commanded the British expedition, and he had learned from the costly lessons of Bunker Hill. No more frontal assaults against entrenched Americans. This time, he would use his superior numbers, training, and tactical flexibility to outmaneuver the rebels. Alongside Howe sailed his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, commanding the most powerful naval force in the world. Together, the Howe brothers represented the full might of the British Empire, determined to crush this colonial rebellion once and for all. The American defenses on Long Island appeared formidable on paper. Major General Nathanael Greene had originally been tasked with fortifying Brooklyn Heights, the key terrain overlooking New York Harbor. Greene understood that whoever controlled the heights controlled the harbor, and whoever controlled the harbor controlled New York City. His plans were sound, his engineering solid, but fate intervened in the cruelest manner possible. Just days before the expected British assault, Greene fell violently ill with fever. Washington, faced with an impossible choice, replaced him with Major General John Sullivan, a brave but inexperienced officer who lacked Greene's intimate knowledge of the terrain and defenses. The change in command created confusion and uncertainty at the worst possible moment. Sullivan found himself commanding a force of approximately 10,000 men, spread across a defensive line that stretched from the Gowanus Creek in the west to Jamaica Pass in the east. The Americans had identified for main passes through the wooded hills of Long Island, where the British might attack: the Gowanus Road, the Flatbush Road, the Bedford Road, and the Jamaica Road. 3 of these passes were well defended, but the fourth, the Jamaica Pass, was guarded by only a handful of mounted patrols. As August 26 dawned clear and bright, British landed boats began their approach to the shores of Long Island. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Thousands of red-coated soldiers disembarking in perfect formation, while their officers barked orders in crisp English accents. The American Revolution was about to face its greatest test, and many would not survive the lesson it was about to teach. The thunderous roar of cannon fire shattered the pre-dawn silence of August 27, 1776, as British warships unleashed a devastating bombardment against American positions along the Brooklyn shoreline. General William Howe's massive invasion force had spent the night positioning itself for what would become the largest battle of the American Revolutionary War. 22,000 British and Hessian troops, the flower of European military might, prepared to demonstrate the futility of colonial resistance. Howe's battle plan was a masterpiece of military deception and tactical brilliance. While his subordinates, Major General James Grant and Lieutenant General Leopold Philip D. Heister, launched diversionary attacks against the western positions near Gowanus Creek and the central Flatbush Road. Howe himself would lead the main assault force in a sweeping flanking maneuver through the lightly defended Jamaica Pass. It was a gamble that required precise timing and coordination, but if successful, it would trap the entire American left wing in a deadly vice. According to historical accounts from the Journal of the American Revolution, the British commander had spent weeks studying captured American deserters and local loyalist intelligence reports. The information consistently pointed to the same weakness. The Americans had concentrated their defenses along the obvious approaches, while leaving their eastern flank dangerously exposed. Howe intended to exploit this oversight with devastating effect. As the morning sun climbed higher, American sentries along the defensive line reported heavy British activity to their front. The sound of marching feet, rattling equipment, and shouted commands echoed across the fields as Hessian troops under De Heister formed their battle lines near the village of Flatbush. Their distinctive brass-fronted mitre caps gleamed in the sunlight, and their disciplined movements spoke of years of European warfare experience. These were not the raw recruits who had fled from Lexington and Concord. These were professional killers. Major General John Sullivan, still struggling to master the complexities of his new command, rushed between his various positions trying to assess the developing threat. Reports flooded in from across his defensive line. British ships were landing. More troops near Dennis Point. Hessian artillery was being wheeled into position along the Flatbush Road, and Scottish Highlanders under Grant were advancing toward the Stonehouse near Gowanus Creek. Every indication suggested that the main British assault would come against his prepared positions. What Sullivan did not know was that this impressive display of force was merely theater, while his attention was fixed on the obvious threats to his front. General Howe was leading 10,000 British troops on a 17-mile night march around the American left flank, moving in complete silence through the darkness. This mass of force had already passed through the undefended Jamaica Pass and was now positioning itself behind the American lines. The few American patrols assigned to watch the Jamaica Pass had been easily captured or driven off by British light infantry. Local loyalist guides, eager to assist the Crown forces, had shown Howe's men every deer path and farm road that could facilitate their movement. By dawn, the trap was set, though the Americans remained blissfully unaware of their peril. At the Stonehouse, Brigadier General William Alexander, who styled himself Lord Stirling despite the British government's refusal to recognize his inherited Scottish title, prepared his men for what he expected would be a straightforward defensive action. His Delaware and Maryland regiments were among the best-trained units in the Continental Army, and they had proven their courage in earlier engagements. Stirling was confident that his men could hold their ground against whatever the British might throw at them. Similarly, along the Flatbush Road, American troops checked their muskets and adjusted their equipment as they watched the Hessian formations deploying in the distance. Many of these soldiers were veterans of the Siege of Boston, and they had learned to respect British military prowess while maintaining confidence in their own abilities. They had no way of knowing that they were about to become the anvil upon which Howe's hammer would strike. The first musket shots cracked across the morning air at precisely 9 o'clock, as British light infantry engaged American outposts along the Gowanus Road. What began as scattered skirmishing quickly escalated into a full-scale firefight, as Lord Stirling's men found themselves facing the disciplined advance of Major General James Grant's forces. The Scottish general, still smarting from his earlier prediction that he could march from one end of America to the other with 5,000 men, was determined to prove British superiority through force of arms. Stirling's Delaware and Maryland troops fought with remarkable tenacity, using every stone wall, fence line, and farmhouse as cover while they poured devastating volleys into the advancing British ranks. The Americans had learned hard lessons about European military tactics during the Siege of Boston, and they applied that knowledge with deadly efficiency. British casualties mounted steadily as Grant's men struggled to advance across the open ground toward the American positions. Meanwhile, along the Flatbush Road, the thunder of Hessian artillery announced the beginning of Lieutenant General De Heister's assault. The German mercenaries advanced with mechanical precision, their steel-tipped pikes glinting in the morning sun as they formed their battle squares. American defenders, many of them New York militia who had never faced such professional soldiers, watched in growing terror as the Hessians deployed their full panoply of European warfare. The sound of fifes and drums filled the air as the Hessians began their advance, stepping off in perfect unison despite the rough terrain. Their reputation for brutality had preceded them across the Atlantic, and many Americans knew that surrender to these foreign mercenaries might mean death rather than prisoner exchange. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Several militia units began to waver even before the first shots were fired, but these two attacks, as fierce as they appeared, were merely the opening movements in Howe's grand symphony of destruction. While American attention remained fixed on the obvious threats to their front, the British commander was putting the finishing touches on his masterstroke. 10,000 British and Hessian troops had completed their flanking march, and now lay concealed in the woods behind the American left wing, waiting for the signal to spring their trap. At 8:30 in the morning, the cannon shots echoed, Across the battlefield has prearranged signal for the coordinated assault to begin. The sound sent a chill through every American who heard it, though few understood its true significance. Those two shots announced the beginning of what would become known as the Battle of Long Island, and they sealed the fate of thousands of Continental soldiers who had no idea. They were already surrounded, General Sullivan, still believing he faced a conventional frontal assault, had committed his reserves to reinforce the threatened sectors along the Gowanus and Flatbush roads. His decision was tactically sound based on the information available to him, but it played directly into Howe's hands by the time the trap was revealed. Sullivan would have no mobile reserves left to respond to the crisis. The first indication that something had gone terribly wrong came from American sentries posted near the village of Bedford. Riders came galloping toward Sullivan's headquarters with reports that seemed impossible to believe. British troops were advancing from the northeast, attacking positions that should have been secured behind American lines. The riders spoke of thousands of enemy soldiers emerging from the woods like ghosts, their bayonets fixed and their battle cries echoing across the countryside. Sullivan's blood ran cold as he grasped the implications of these reports. If British forces had indeed penetrated behind his lines, then his entire army was in mortal danger. Every tactical manual he had ever studied emphasized the importance of maintaining secure flanks and lines of communication. Now, through his own oversight and inexperience, he had allowed the enemy to achieve the one thing that could destroy his command completely: tactical surprise on a strategic scale. The trap had been sprung with perfect precision, and the American Continental Army was about to learn a harsh lesson about the realities of 18th century warfare. Professional soldiers with superior training, equipment, and leadership were demonstrating why European powers had dominated global military affairs for centuries. The question now was whether any Americans would survive to benefit from this brutal education. The American left wing collapsed like a house of cards as General Howe's flanking force burst from the woods with fixed bayonets, their battle cry of "God save the King," drowning out the desperate shouts of Continental officers trying to rally their men. What had been an organized defensive line moments before dissolved into chaos, as thousands of American soldiers found themselves caught between British forces attacking from both front and rear. Major General John Sullivan, realizing the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around him, attempted to organize a fighting withdrawal toward the Brooklyn Heights fortifications, but his orders were lost in the pandemonium as units became separated from their commanders, and individual soldiers made desperate decisions about whether to fight, surrender, or flee. The carefully planned defensive positions that had taken weeks to construct were abandoned in minutes as the American army began to disintegrate. The psychological impact of being outflanked was devastating to colonial morale. These men had volunteered to fight for liberty and independence, but they had never faced anything like the coordinated assault now overwhelming their positions. European military doctrine emphasized the importance of maintaining unit cohesion under fire, but the Continental Army lacked the training and experience necessary to execute such complex maneuvers. Under combat conditions, British and Hessian troops, sensing victory within their grasp, pressed their advantage with ruthless efficiency. The bayonet, that symbol of European military supremacy, proved devastatingly effective against American forces who had relied primarily on musket fire. In their previous engagements, colonial soldiers, many of whom carried hunting rifles better suited for frontier warfare than battlefield combat, found themselves helpless against the disciplined advance of professional infantry. Lord Stirling's Maryland and Delaware regiments, still engaged in their desperate fight along the Gowanus Road, suddenly found themselves facing a new threat as British forces moved to cut off their line of retreat. The British trap was closing with mechanical precision, and it appeared that the entire American force might be captured or destroyed before the day was over. Stirling faced an agonizing choice: attempt to save his men through immediate retreat, or make a stand that might allow other American units to escape. The answer came in the form of one of the most heroic actions of the entire Revolutionary War. Rather than abandon his positions, Stirling chose to launch a series of desperate counterattacks against overwhelming British forces, buying precious time for other American units to reach the safety of the Brooklyn Heights fortifications. His Maryland regiment, numbering only 400 men, charged repeatedly into British lines that outnumbered them by more than 10 to 1. Historical records from the Maryland Historical Society document that Stirling's men launched no fewer then 6 separate attacks against British positions near the Cortelyou House, each time fighting their way through superior numbers before being forced to fall back and regroup. The cost was horrific by the end of the day. Only a handful of the Maryland Regiment would answer roll call, but their sacrifice achieved its purpose. Hundreds of other American soldiers lived to fight another day because of Sterling's decision to stand and fight. Meanwhile, the collapse of the American center and left wing created opportunities for individual acts of heroism and cowardice alike. Some Continental soldiers threw down their weapons and fled toward the East River, hoping to swim to safety despite the presence of British warships in the harbor. Others formed small groups and attempted to fight their way back to friendly lines, using their knowledge of local terrain to avoid British patrols. The carnage was particularly severe among the American officers, who exposed themselves to enemy fire while trying to maintain some semblance of order among their retreating men. Major General Sullivan himself was captured while attempting to rally his troops near the village of Flatbush, leaving the American forces without unified command at the moment when leadership was most desperately needed. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the Battle of Long Island would be remembered as one of the worst defeats in American military history. Entire regiments had ceased to exist as organized units. Hundreds of soldiers lay dead or wounded on the battlefield, and nearly 1,000 more had been taken prisoner. The Continental Army's first major test against professional European forces had ended in complete disaster, and many observers wondered whether the cause of American independence could survive such a devastating blow. As twilight descended over the blood-soaked fields of Long Island, the true magnitude of the American disaster became apparent to both friend and foe alike. British campfires flickered like stars across the landscape, marking the positions of victorious troops who had achieved everything their commanders could have hoped for. General William Howe had demonstrated conclusively that European military professionalism remained superior to colonial enthusiasm, and his forces now stood poised to deliver the death blow to American independence. The remnants of the Continental Army huddled behind the earthworks of Brooklyn Heights, their ranks depleted and their morale shattered by the day's catastrophic events. Of the approximately 10,000 American troops who had begun the battle, nearly 2,000 were now dead, wounded, or captured. The survivors faced the grim reality that they were trapped on a narrow peninsula with the British Army to their front and the Royal Navy controlling the waters behind them. General George Washington, who had spent the day frantically trying to coordinate the defense from his headquarters in Manhattan, finally crossed to Brooklyn that evening to assess the situation personally. What he found there filled him with despair and determination. In equal measure, his army was beaten but not broken, bloodied but still breathing. The question was whether they would live to see another sunrise. British forces, confident in their overwhelming victory, began preparations for what they assumed would be the final assault against the American fortifications. General Howe, however, chose to proceed cautiously rather than risk heavy casualties in a night attack against prepared positions. The memory of Bunker Hill still haunted British military thinking, and Howe was determined not to waste his advantage through precipitous action. He would wait for dawn and then overwhelm the American positions with artillery before sending his infantry forward. This decision would prove to be one of the most consequential mistakes in British military history, though no one could have predicted it at the time. Howe's caution gave Washington precious hours to contemplate what many considered an impossible situation. The American commander-in-chief faced the most critical decision of his career: attempt to hold Brooklyn Heights against overwhelming odds, or find some way to evacuate his army before it was completely destroyed. According to accounts preserved in the Washington papers at the Library of Congress, the American general spent much of the night walking among his troops, speaking quietly with officers and enlisted men alike. What he saw in their faces was not the panic he had feared, but rather a grim determination to continue fighting despite the day's disasters. These men had learned hard lessons about the realities of warfare, but they had not lost faith in their cause. The weather, which had been clear and bright throughout the day, began to change as evening progressed. Thick fog began rolling in from the harbor, and a light rain started to fall, providing natural concealment that sharp-eyed American officers began to recognize as providential. If Washington could organize an evacuation under cover of darkness and weather, there might yet be hope for the Continental Army. The plan that emerged was audacious in its scope and desperate in its necessity. Every available boat in the New York area would be commandeered for a secret nighttime evacuation. Across the East River to Manhattan, the operation would require perfect timing, absolute silence, and more than a little luck. Discovery by British forces would mean the complete annihilation of the Continental Army and the probable end of the American Revolution. Washington entrusted the maritime aspects of the evacuation to Colonel John Glover and his regiment of Marblehead fishermen, men whose knowledge of boats and tides might mean the difference between salvation and disaster. These hardy New Englanders had already proven their worth during the crossing of the Delaware River earlier in the campaign, and they would need to draw upon every ounce of their seamanship to save the army. As midnight approached, the first boats began their silent journey across the dark waters of the East River. American soldiers, many of whom had never been on a boat in their lives, were loaded into everything from military transports to fishing skiffs and ferry boats. The wounded were given priority, followed by the artillery pieces that could be saved, and finally the infantry units that had borne the brunt of the day's fighting. The evacuation proceeded with agonizing slowness, each trip across the river consuming precious time, while British sentries remained dangerously close to the American positions. Officers moved among the troops, whispering orders and maintaining discipline through sheer force of will. Any noise, any light, any sign of movement might alert the enemy and doom the entire operation. The fog that had begun as a light mist now thickened into an impenetrable blanket that shrouded the East River and the Brooklyn shore in ghostly silence. What had seemed like merely fortunate weather now appeared to be divine intervention. To the desperate American soldiers preparing for the most audacious evacuation in military history, General Washington moved among his troops like a specter, his presence both calming and inspiring as he oversaw every detail of the withdrawal. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead fishermen worked with quiet efficiency born of years spent navigating treacherous New England waters. Their knowledge of currents, tides, and seamanship proved invaluable as they guided an increasingly diverse fleet of vessels back and forth across the river. Whaling boats worked alongside military transports, fishing skiffs carried artillery pieces, and even improvised rafts bore their precious human cargo toward the safety of Manhattan's shore. The deception required to maintain British ignorance of the evacuation was as complex as the maritime operation itself. Skeleton crews remained at the forward positions, maintaining the appearance of normal defensive activity, while the bulk of the army slipped away into the darkness. Officers moved constantly among the remaining troops, ensuring that cooking fires continued to burn and that sentries maintained their posts with visible vigilance. American ingenuity shone brightest in the darkest hour as soldiers improvised solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Cannon wheels were wrapped in cloth to muffle their sound. As artillery pieces were moved to the embarkation points, officers' horses had their hooves muffled and their bridles padded to prevent noise. Even the oarlocks of the boats were wrapped in fabric to eliminate the telltale sound of rowing that might carry across the water to British ears. The human cost of the evacuation was measured not only in the physical exhaustion of men who had been fighting and marching for nearly 24 hours, but also in the emotional trauma of leaving behind wounded comrades who could not be moved. American surgeons worked frantically to stabilize the most seriously injured, while chaplains provided what comfort they could to those who would not survive the night. These were the hardest decisions of the war, and they fell disproportionately on junior officers who lacked the experience to make such terrible choices. As the night progressed, the pace of the evacuation began to accelerate as Glover's men mastered the rhythm of the river crossing. More boats became available as word spread through the New York maritime community, and civilian volunteers joined the effort despite the obvious danger to themselves. Ferry operators, fishermen, and merchant sailors all contributed their vessels and expertise to what they understood might be the last chance to save American independence. The British, incredibly, remained unaware of the massive operation unfolding. Less than a mile from their forward positions, the combination of fog, rain, and overconfidence created a perfect storm of circumstances that allowed thousands of American soldiers to slip away undetected. General Howe's decision to wait for daylight before launching his final assault gave Washington exactly the time he needed to save his army. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the evacuation had achieved a rhythm that seemed almost supernatural in its efficiency. Regiment after regiment filed silently toward the boats, their footsteps muffled by the wet ground and their voices reduced to barely audible whispers. The fog had become so thick that soldiers could barely see their own hands. But this impenetrable curtain also meant that British sentries could observe nothing of the American withdrawal. Washington himself remained on Brooklyn Heights until the very last moment, personally ensuring that no man was left behind who could possibly be saved. His presence during those final hours became legendary among the troop who witnessed it, and stories of his calm determination under impossible pressure would be told and read all throughout the war. When the last boat finally departed Brooklyn at dawn, it carried not only the remnants of the Continental Army, but also the hopes of a nascent nation. The British awakened on the morning of August 30th to find nothing but empty trenches and abandoned campfires where they expected to discover a trapped and defeated enemy. General Howe's careful preparations for the final assault had been rendered meaningless by an operation that historians would later rank among the greatest military evacuations in history. The Continental Army lived to fight another day, and with it survived the dream of American independence. The morning sun of August 30th, 1776, revealed to British forces what their overconfidence had cost them. Empty American trenches stretched along Brooklyn Heights like an accusation, their abandoned campfires still smoldering in the dawn light. General William Howe stared across the East River at Manhattan, where the Continental Army that should have been his prisoners was already digging new defensive positions. The complete American escape represented a strategic blunder that would haunt British operations for the remainder of the war. For the Continental Army, however, the successful evacuation could not disguise the harsh realities revealed by the Battle of Long Island. American casualties totaled nearly 2,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, representing almost 20% of Washington's entire force. More devastating than the numerical losses was the psychological impact of facing professional European soldiers in open combat. The militia system that had served adequately in guerrilla actions against isolated British outposts proved woefully inadequate against coordinated military operations. Washington understood immediately that the lessons of Long Island would determine whether American independence remained a realistic possibility or descended into romantic delusion. In his reports to the Continental Congress, the commanding general was brutally honest about his army's deficiencies. The troops lacked discipline, training, and experience in conventional warfare. Their officers, with few exceptions, were amateurs learning the craft through trial and error. Most critically, the American military system lacked the institutional knowledge necessary to compete with European powers on equal terms. The battle had also revealed dangerous weaknesses in American intelligence gathering and strategic planning. The failure to adequately defend Jamaica Pass was not merely an oversight, but a symptom of deeper problems in military organization. Professional armies maintained elaborate networks of scouts, spies, and local informants to provide commanders with accurate information about enemy movements. The Continental Army operated largely blind, dependent on unreliable reports from civilian volunteers who lacked military training. General Nathanael Greene, recovered from his illness and restored to command, spent weeks analyzing every aspect of the Long Island disaster. His conclusions, shared with Washington and other senior officers, became the foundation for fundamental reforms in Continental Army organization and tactics. According to military historians from the American Battlefield Trust, Greene's post-battle analysis identified specific areas where American forces could adapt European military doctrine to colonial conditions and resources. The most immediate change involved abandoning the linear tactics that had proven so disastrous against British professional soldiers. Instead of attempting to match European armies in conventional battles, American forces would emphasize mobility, local knowledge, and unconventional warfare. The Continental Army would avoid major engagements except under the most favorable circumstances, preferring to wear down British forces through a campaign of raids, ambushes, and strategic withdrawals. Training programs instituted in the wake of Long Island focused intensively on basic military skills that European soldiers took for granted. American troops learned proper marching formations, battlefield communications, and the complex maneuvers necessary for coordinated military action. Most importantly, they practiced the disciplined retreats that would become hallmarks of Washington's strategy throughout the war. The ability to withdraw in good order under enemy pressure proved just as valuable as the courage to attack. The officer corps underwent its own transformation as Washington recognized that brave amateurs could not compete with professional military leadership. The Continental Congress authorized the recruitment of European military advisors, beginning with Baron Friedrich von Steuben, whose training methods would revolutionize American military capabilities. Native-born officers like Greene, Henry Knox, and Alexander Hamilton supplemented their natural abilities with intensive study of European military theory and practice. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Long Island forced American political leaders to confront the true costs of independence. The romantic notion that citizen soldiers motivated by love of liberty could easily defeat professional armies gave way to realistic assessments of what victory would require. The Continental Congress authorized longer enlistments, higher pay, and better equipment for American forces, while also recognizing that foreign assistance would be essential for ultimate success. The psychological impact of the Long Island evacuation on American morale proved as important as any tactical lesson. Despite suffering a devastating defeat, the Continental Army had survived through courage, ingenuity, and divine providence. The successful escape became a symbol of American resilience and determination, proof that the cause of independence could survive even the darkest moments. Soldiers who had fled in panic from British bayonets found new confidence in their ability to outthink and outmaneuver their enemies. The Battle of Long Island thus marked a turning point in the American Revolution, though not in the way that either side expected. Rather than ending American resistance, the defeat and subsequent escape forced the Continental Army to confront its limitations and adapt accordingly. The lessons learned in blood on the fields of Brooklyn would be applied with increasing effectiveness throughout the war, ultimately contributing to American victory at Yorktown 5 years later. The wake-up call delivered by British and Hessian professionals on that August morning in 1776 had awakened not just an army, but a nation to the true requirements of independence.